Good morning. My name is Stephanie Kehler, and I'm a science teacher here at Sequoyah Mid-High High School. I teach physical science and zoology, so today I thought I would do a genetics lesson. Before I begin with the genetics lesson, I want to talk about the physical science kids this week because there's been a little confusion with the assignment that you have. The physical science students are studying 6 simple machines. And so in physical science, the 6 simple machines are pulley, inclined plane, wedge, screw, wheel and axle, and lever. Ooh, that was close. What I need you to do is use those 6 simple machines as individual slides, define them, and then use your selfies from home of those examples of those 6 simple machines. Some people are just kind of coming up with their own simple machines, but there's actual 6 simple machines in physical science, and those are the ones that I want you to use. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me, and I will answer those for you as best I can. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about genetics. Most of what I'm going to use for examples is human genetics because that's what I do in my classroom. But remember, all of this is going to relate to anything that has cells with DNA in it. When we first started this, we did strawberry DNA, and we extracted the DNA from a lot of cells. This is all just going to be the compilation of one cell's DNA. And how does that affect you or the plant that has DNA or an animal that has DNA? So when I usually teach this lesson, I started out by calling it, "Why do you look like that?" or "Why are you so funny looking?" just because I think it's hilarious. But one of the questions is these features, or what gives my son these features? And the good news is, if I ask you why you're so funny looking, it's not your fault, it's your parents' fault. So this is a 3-generation picture of my family, and you can look and see there's some physical characteristics that are similar between us, and then there's some characteristics that you're like, I couldn't even tell that you were related, maybe. That applies to a bunch of different families. Why does one kid have blue eyes and another kid has brown eyes? Or why do my parents have brown hair and I ended up with blonde hair? It all goes back to genetics. So what we're going to talk about first, there's a couple vocabulary terms in here that I want to focus on, is a term phenotype, okay? The word phenotype is the way that you look. All right, phenotype, I always tell kids, think about the first 2 letters. It's your physical characteristics. And your phenotype is actually determined by 2 different things. Your DNA, your genetic traits, and anything that makes you look the way you look that is not in your genetic code, we're going to call environmental, okay? So my DNA that I inherited from my parents that give me my physical characteristics, and then there's other things along the way that add to my physical characteristics that are not genetically inherited. So I'm going to start with this picture of Harry Potter and go through, and what I would normally do is say, give me a list of 10 things to describe what Harry Potter looks like, and I give this picture in class and say, okay, what do you see? So the first thing that I would notice is that he has dark hair. Actually, probably the first thing I would notice is his scar from Voldemort. I'd notice that he has dark hair. You could talk about the texture of his hair. He's wearing glasses. But you can go to simple things, not just things that make him look different from me or from you, but also look at characteristics that make him different from a plant or your dog or a bacteria, okay? All of those are in your genetic code, okay? So I could say he's got 2 eyes, he has a nose, he has so many teeth, he has 2 arms. All those things go into his phenotype, okay? So then we're going to break those down into what's genetic and what's environmental, okay? So when I look at his genetic code, his hair color, he inherited from James and Lily. Those are his parents. He inherited that from that, so that's a genetic trait. So maybe his hair texture, we could also talk about that. Is it curly hair or is it straight hair? That's a genetic trait, something he inherited from his parents. So when I look at Harry, what can you notice that's not genetic? What would be some of his environmental traits? You might mention his glasses. The physical glasses himself, wearing them, might be environmental, but the reason he needs his glasses might be genetic traits. Sometimes people wear glasses just because they're getting older like myself and their eye lenses are changing. It's kind of like getting gray hair as you get older. It's not a genetic trait. It's kind of like deterioration over time. We've used them really good. But sometimes when you're born young and you need glasses from an early age, it's actually a genetic trait that you inherited from your parents. The big one is probably his scar, okay? That's definitely an environmental trait. And the other thing you can do is look at it and say, am I passing this on to my kids? Do my parents have it, or am I able to pass it on to my kids? So like I have a big scar on my arm from when I broke off the end of my elbow when I was a freshman. I didn't pass it on to my son. He didn't come out with a big giant scar on his arm. Some other environmental factors that contribute to your phenotype can be piercings, okay? Those don't pass on to your kids. Tattoos are another environmental trait. They're things that physically describe how you look. They're part of your phenotype, but they didn't come from your genetic code. And then I usually take the opportunity to say to kids, wouldn't it be funny if your environmental traits did pass on to your kids? So like the tattoos that your parents have, you have when you're born, or your tattoos pass on to your kids, and they usually have a lot to say about that. It's just funny to me. So what we're going to study today is how did we get those inherited traits, okay? And so what we're going to do, it says heredity includes the DNA that's received from each parent. I am not a carbon copy of my mom. I'm not a carbon copy of my dad. I have genetic information from both of them, okay? In the human karyotype, this is a picture of someone's DNA. There should be 46 chromosomes, okay? I get 23 from my mom, and I get 23 from my dad. And then the combination of those 46 chromosomes makes me look the way that I look. And I don't always get the same chromosomes from mom and dad that my siblings get, okay? So that can also change. There's just different combinations that you can receive. So when you look at this, you probably can't see from where you're at, but they're numbered. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every chromosome has particular genes located on it. So this chromosome right here, I'm going to advance this just for a second and then go back, is just a bunch of genes that are stuck together. And a gene is just a section of DNA that codes for one particular trait. So there's a gene for eye color, and there's a gene for hair color, and sometimes there's more than one gene. The interaction of those genes makes you look the way that you look. But in general, this is what they're saying here. So each one of these bands is supposed to represent a different trait that we're coding for. And this isn't an accurate one. It tells you at the bottom. It's just for an example. But this band right here might code for height. And this band right here might code for eye color. But when I physically link them all together, this whole big thing becomes a chromosome. And then I get 23 of those chromosomes from mom and 23 of those chromosomes from dad. What's interesting is that this might have, let's say that chromosome number 1 that we just showed. This little band right here might say eye color, but it doesn't tell me what my eye color in particular is. Moms might say I get brown eyes, and dads might say I get blue eyes, or they might both say the same thing. So when we look at the karyotype, it's kind of that piece of information. You have to have more technology to break that down. But what I can tell from the karyotype is that there's 46 chromosomes here, which is normal. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less, but you're going to notice that in their phenotype. The other thing that you may notice is that through these 23 pairs of chromosomes, it goes down here 19, 20, 21, 22, and then for the 23rd set, they don't actually number it. They call it the sex chromosome. It's the XY series. And in all of these cases, they look pretty similar. This is chromosome 13. They're about the same length, which is shorter than chromosome 2. Chromosome 21 is pretty short. But over here, we have a really long chromosome and a short chromosome. These are two different chromosomes. If you have the long one, which is an X, and the short one, which is a Y, that's going to be the genetic code for a boy. And if you're a girl, you actually have two X chromosomes there. So when you look at the karyotype, the first thing that you should be able to tell me is, does it have the correct number? Count up the number of 46 chromosomes, but also you can look at the genetic code for gender. Chromosomes here that are coding for the same traits are all called homologous. The prefix homo means same, so they're coding for the same traits. When you get down here, if you have an XY chromosome, they're not homologous anymore. The X chromosome will code for traits that the Y chromosome doesn't have. And so you'll see a lot of interesting genetic expression through that as well. Okay, so here's another picture of a karyotype. This is a diagram as opposed to a picture. That last one was a legitimate picture. If you are pregnant, they can actually do an amniocentesis and take cells from the baby before it's born. It actually comes from the amniotic fluid, and you can create one of these karyotypes and know the gender of your child before it's born without the ultrasound. Or you can look if you have concerns about genetic malformations. And so you can go through and count them up. But again, each one of these little bars, it represents a different gene that codes for a trait that makes you look the way that you look. And then when you get down here, you'll notice if it's an X and a Y, a long one and a short one, it's a boy. And if you have two X's, then it's going to be a girl. Okay, so your genetic traits that contribute to your phenotype are called your genotype. Okay, and so when you look at that genotype, we're going to take away all the stuff that happened to me throughout my lifetime to make me look the way that I look. I'll take away the scar factor. If there's any tattoos, my piercings, those don't contribute to the genotype. The genotype is only the genetic code that I received from mom and dad. So each one of them will give me an allele. An allele is like a version of a gene. So I always tell kids, if you think about a gene as being a category, the allele is all the examples that you can have in that category. So a gene might be eye color. And then the alleles would be if I can have blue or green or brown or hazel. And so you can do the same thing with hair color. There's different forms of genes, and those are called alleles. So in this example for hair color, I have black, I have red, and I have blonde. There's also brown. There's other colors. And then again, remember, sometimes these genes aren't just one gene to code for it. It's multiple genes working together to create your phenotype and what you look like. But allele just means what is the version of the gene that we have. Okay, so last new vocabulary, I think, is that your alleles can be dominant or they can be recessive. So the way this works is if I have a parent that says, Stephanie, you're going to have brown eyes, and then my other parent's genetic code says you're going to have brown eyes, those two genes have the same alleles. And when you see that expressed, you're going to see in my phenotype that I have brown hair. You can also look at it for if it's another color. But what happens when you mix them together? There's a principle called the principle of dominance that says one allele should be dominant to another allele. And it doesn't work for every single situation, but this is the main course. There's always exceptions, but this is the main trend that you typically see. And so, for example, curly hair and straight hair are part of the genetic code. And so when I talk about them, curly hair is dominant to straight hair. So here's what's going to happen. Let me set this down for a second. I have a gene for curly hair from one parent, and I have a gene for curly hair from another parent. And I know you can't see it today because I straightened my hair, but I definitely have curly hair. Those two genes are saying the exact same thing. But if I had parents that said straight hair allele from mom, straight hair allele from dad, put those together, your child's going to end up with straight hair. But what happens if one parent gives an allele that says curly hair, and I have another parent that has an allele that says straight hair? Well, according to the principle of dominance, that curly hair is a dominant trait, and it will cover up or mask the recessive allele. So when I look at your phenotype, all I see is curly hair. But that recessive allele of straight hair is still there. It doesn't go away. We just mask it. We cover it up so that you can't see it in the phenotype. And so what's kind of interesting about that is if you have these masked alleles, when you pass on your genetic code to your kids, you can only pass on one. You can pass on that curly hair trait, or you can pass on that straight hair gene. And if the kid gets straight hair but you didn't have it, that's how that happens. You had a recessive allele that was masked that you had inherited from your parents, from the parents before that. So like my grandson has blue eyes. His parents don't have blue eyes. We don't have blue eyes, but his great-grandpa has blue eyes. For 2 generations, it was masked. It was covered up. And now in his generation, it's expressed. We get to see it. So I think that's kind of fun. It's like a puzzle to me. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to use, I'm going to try blue, and hopefully you can see it. The abbreviation code that they're going to use in genetics is just to abbreviate it with one letter to show what's dominant and what's recessive. So in curly hair, it's dominant, and we'll use the first letter of the dominant trait. So whenever we want to write something for curly hair, we're going to put a capital C. Do we like the blue or do we like the green, Mr. Berg?
Green.
Okay, so we're going to use a capital C for dominant. And then for showing that something is recessive, when I'm writing it down and taking notes, I'm going to use a lowercase c. And I usually tell kids to try and make it cursive so that it looks a little bit different. This little c means it's a recessive trait, which is straight hair. The capital C actually means that it's dominant. And then when you show those two together, we're only going to see the dominant trait in the phenotype. So that's kind of fun to see. All right. need a tray, I guess. All right, so what I wanted to do today was kind of give you examples of things in your phenotype, or may not be in your phenotype, that are genetically controlled. And I picked out traits that are only 2 alleles. Because when you get into multiple alleles, more than 2 alleles, then there's a combination and it gets a little bit more difficult. So I thought we'll just go with the simple ones today. It's either yes, you have it, or no, you don't. And so what I would do on Why Are You So Funny Looking Day is I would go through and I would pick out all these traits and have students write down, yes, I have them, or no, I don't. And then you can kind of go back and learn the genetics behind them. So if you look at this picture, I don't know if you can tell the difference between these 2 pictures here, but right here, there's a nice little indention in his face, okay? Dimples are a genetic trait that is inherited from a parent, and dimples is a dominant trait. So what letter would I use to represent dimples? I'm going to use a capital D to represent this guy over here with his dimples. This one doesn't have dimples, so I would put a lowercase d. Recessive trait, dominant trait, but it's all in their genetic code. Okay, by doing this presentation, I learned that there's actually like a dimple surgery, which kind of, but that's what it is. Okay, genetically it's there. All right, so John Travolta, good looking guy. His dimple is not right here in his cheeks. His dimple is right here in his chin. Okay, the chin dimple is actually called a cleft chin, and it's a genetic trait that he inherited from a parent. It can be a mom or it can be a dad, but right here, this indention is called a cleft chin, and it's a dominant trait. So again, what letter would I use to represent this dominant trait? I'm going to use a capital C for John Travolta's chin. I don't have it, so I get a little c. Okay, it is a recessive trait for me. All right. Here's another one. And I noticed these things about people long before I learned about genetics, but I didn't understand that that was a genetic trait. So when you look at these ears, there's 2 different earlobes here. This is called detached or free earlobes, and this is attached earlobes. And the main difference here is when you follow the line of this ear, it's going to loop back up. There's actually an earlobe there, where this one, it just kind of goes straight down into the side. I have kids look at the kid next to them and go, what do my earlobes look like? It's just not something we usually talk about. But do I have detached or do I have attached? Because they always had to tell me which genetic trait that they have. The detached earlobes is actually a dominant trait, so you could use a capital D, or if you called them free earlobes, you could use a capital F. And then over here, somebody that has the attached earlobes is going to be a lowercase d. And most of the time, girls know if they have attached or detached by their jewelry. Most of the time, guys are like, look at my face and tell me what's going on. All right, widow's peak. Widow's peak I typically notice more in girls right away because they wear their ponytails. If they don't have bangs, you can see it right away. So with a widow's peak hairline, it's just pull your hair back, and what does it look like? Some kids will have a line that kind of goes like this, and some kids, and it's not just kids, it's also adults, have more of a straight hairline there. It's a genetic trait that you inherited from a parent. I can specifically remember my first year, this kid was absolutely horrified when they found out they had a widow's peak. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a hairline. The capital W tells me, is it dominant or recessive? It's got to be dominant, okay? And then over here, the straight hairline, this is the one I have, use a cursive W to kind of tell the difference between them when we would write them out, but dominant trait versus recessive. I inherited these from my parents. So somebody has a widow's peak if you have a widow's peak. All right. Hitchhiker's thumb. Hitchhiker's thumb, for the longest time, I always thought it was a dominant trait, but it's a recessive trait. It always makes me laugh. Kids will stick up their thumb and go, what do I have? Is this bent enough for hitchhiker's thumb, or is it not? This is definitely a straight thumb. And apparently it's very traumatic to me because I can still remember my 8th grade math teacher, Mrs. Idle, had the hitchhiker's thumb when she would teach math. It was my favorite subject, so I was always watching. But it's just a genetic code that she inherited from her parents. So regular thumb is actually dominant, so I would use a capital R here. And then my recessive allele over here would be a lowercase r. If you have hitchhiker's thumb, they gave it to you, okay? Now, what's interesting, though, if we go back to the rule of dominance, for all of these, if you have 2 parents that don't have hitchhiker's thumb and you do, it's because they had that masking. They had that recessive allele, and they had it covered up with that dominant trait. And so when they had to send one of those alleles to you to make you, they sent on that recessive allele. It's just kind of fun to think about. It's just a puzzle that you work backwards. Okay. rolling up the tongue. The tongue roll always makes me laugh as well because kids will instantly stick out their tongues unless they cannot. You already know which kids cannot roll their tongues, and it's not like they haven't learned how yet. It's not like tying your shoes. It's something that they physically can't do because they don't have the genetic code to do it. So when they talk about rolling up the tongue, hot dog, okay, then everybody else wants to stick out their tongue. Look what else I can do. There's some kids that have, I can't do it or I'd show it to you, can do like a clover leaf with theirs. That's a different gene, but it's also a gene. It's just something interesting. You're like, tricks that you're teaching people. It's not. It's part of your genetic code. So rolling of the tongue is actually a dominant trait. My favorite show ever was Friends. There's a whole episode where they talk about rolling their tongues and not being able to. So if this kid cannot roll their tongue, are they capital or lowercase? They're lowercase because it's a recessive trait if you cannot roll your tongue. It's nothing you've done wrong, and you're not going to learn how to do it. You just don't have the genetic code to do it. And then there's a whole bunch more that we can go through. This is another one. This one, usually I have kids that have to take their shoes off, but we try and do it in the spring, so you're already wearing flip-flops anyway. Do you notice what's the difference between these feet? Okay, the difference here is called short big toe. Today I learned it's called Morton's toe as well. So if your big toe is shorter than the toe next to it, it's a genetic trait, okay? And over here, this is somebody, they can either be even or they can be longer than the toe next to it. It always makes me laugh if somebody has a really short big toe because the other kids that go swimming with them already know. Look at how much shorter the toe is. Okay, I have big giant finger toes. It's a little bit different, but all of these are genetic traits that we've inherited from our parents. So it says here, everyone has two alleles, the one you got from mom and the one that you got from dad. And that works for all of our genes. It's how those genes are expressed in your phenotype that we're going to see. And so here you can see in this particular mom, she has blue and green. And that blue and green is supposed to represent the alleles she got from her parents. So that would be like the grandparents to you. So they got one from each parent. Over here, dad has red and purple to represent the alleles he got from his parents. So that's the other set of grandparents. And then all of that combines to make you. And it just depends how those combinations come out. There's a bunch of different factors. It's not like I inherit this whole entire gene from my mom. If I get this green particular chromosome, it actually goes through a step in meiosis called crossing over, where you can get combinations of those, which is what this is supposed to represent. And so there's so many different combinations that you can get, even if you have the same parents. But you get one from mom and one from dad if everything goes the way that it's supposed to in meiosis. And so, like, this is a picture of my family. My brother and I, even though I like to make fun of him, look very, very similar. You can see the genetic resemblance. I don't know if you can even see, this might be too dark, but my parents, we both have the same parents. Clearly, they did not send the same genetic code to us because one of us is a boy and one of us is a girl. So there's already that XY chromosome that's going to be different. But there's other characteristics that we have in common. We both have curly hair. We both have about the same color hair. We have about the same color eyes. And that goes back to what combination of alleles were available from our parents. Maybe they only had those combinations to send us, okay? Dad had bright red hair when he was young. Neither of us got that. We got the dominant trait of darker hair from my mom. I have hazel-colored eyes. I want to say that Ryan does. He'll call me later and let me know if I am wrong. And then that my mom has brown eyes, and my dad has these cool, like, blue eyes. So if you kind of look at mine, it's like a combination of the two. But it all came from, back up the bus, how did all of these alleles combine to make this person down here? And then you take all these combinations and pass them on to my kids and pass them on to their kids and then just keep going. So the combination is what makes us genetically genetically unique. And we won't see that genetic cloning going on. The other thing that you're going to notice is, we're going back to the word phenotype, if we have genetically identical twins, they should have this code look exactly the same. And you probably know genetically identical twins. We had 3 sets of twins in 9th grade this year, so you know some probably. They still will not phenotypically be exactly the same. I can constantly ask, how do you tell the difference between Carson and Caleb? And I can look at their genotype and I wouldn't be able to tell. But environmental factors also contribute to it. And then there can also be changes in their DNA as they're developing. So all of that goes into into your phenotype. All right, and I think that's pretty much it. This is my cool family, and this is me. Guys, I want to thank you for staying with us today and enjoying a session on genetics. Next week, we'll be back for our final week of RSU TV, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.